On the morning of September 1st, 1996, the Israeli military moved troops to the Syrian border in preparation for a war. Not a drill, not a precaution, a war. Armor columns rolled north toward the Golan Heights. The Northern Command went to elevated readiness. Senior IDF commanders, men who had fought in the Yom Kippur War, men who had nearly died when Syria came without warning in October 1973, were inside the High Command not merely prepared to fight, but pushing for it. The intelligence report on the table was specific, urgent, and unambiguous. Syria was planning a lightning strike. Damascus intended to retake the Golan. There was no time to wait. "Strike first," the commanders said. "Strike now." The pressure landed on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's desk. Issue the order. Launch before they can. He didn't. Netanyahu weighed Gil's report against other intelligence that pointed in a different direction, toward a Syria still maneuvering diplomatically, not militarily. The troops stood down. The alert passed, the border went quiet. Neither country ever announced publicly how close the moment had been. 14 months later, in November 1997, journalist Ronen Bergman, senior intelligence correspondent for Yediot Ahronoth and later a contributing writer for the New York Times magazine, met in secret with a senior member of the Israeli intelligence community. The man told him a story that Bergman, a reporter who had spent his career inside the darkest corridors of Mossad history, said he found nearly impossible to believe. A legendary Mossad operative had been arrested. The charge: he had fabricated the intelligence that brought Israel to the brink of that war. His name was Yehuda Gil. He was 63 years old. He had served the Mossad for nearly 3 decades. And for years, the exact number would become one of the most contested facts of the entire affair. He had been filing intelligence reports that were not intelligence. They were invention. His own knowledge, his own assumptions, his own construction, attributed to a source who was no longer providing anything of value, filed through channels that had never been designed to catch a man of his standing. This is the story of how that happened. Not the arrest, not the trial. Those came later. This is the story of how a man builds the conditions for a deception so durable that an institution famous for seeing through lies cannot see through his. Yehuda Gil did not arrive at the Mossad as a legend. He built one, carefully, over the course of a career that began in 1970. He had come to Israel from Libya as a young man. That origin mattered in practical terms. He arrived fluent in Arabic, carrying an intuitive understanding of the Arab world that Israeli-born officers had to spend years acquiring secondhand. The Mossad, whose primary operational theater in those years was the Arab Middle East, valued this fluency the way a carpenter values a tool that works every time without adjustment. Gil could move in Arab spaces, read Arab rooms, and construct the kind of credibility with Arab sources that required cultural fluency no training course could fully replicate. He also spoke several European languages, which extended his range. He was, from the beginning, built for the most demanding kind of human intelligence work, getting people to trust you across the widest possible distance. What he did with that foundation over the following decade left a record that the Mossad found genuinely difficult to set aside, even years later when the record of a different kind was accumulating. In the aftermath of the Munich Olympics massacre in September 1972, when the Palestinian group Black September killed 11 Israeli athletes and coaches in the most visible act of terrorism the world had witnessed to that point, Israel's response was not diplomatic. The Mossad hunted. It located, tracked, and killed the men responsible, one by one, across Europe and the Middle East. The operation unfolded over years. Gil was among the operatives involved. The specifics of his role remain classified, but his participation is documented. He was not watching from the outside, he was inside it. Later, he collected intelligence that fed into Israel's understanding of Iraq's nuclear facility at Osirak, the facility the Israeli Air Force destroyed in a single strike in June 1981, an operation so precise and so unexpected that it functionally ended Iraq's nuclear program and permanently altered the calculus of preemptive military action in the region. The strike required knowing exactly what to hit and where. That knowledge came from somewhere. Gil was part of where. He built intelligence networks in Sudan, operating in an environment where the margins for error were narrow and the cover stories had to hold against sustained scrutiny. He was a central operational figure in what the Mossad called Brothers, known publicly as Operation Moses, the covert series of airlifts that brought approximately 7,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel through Sudan in the mid-1980s. For that operation to run, someone had to manage the intelligence and political dimensions inside Sudan while the airlifts were ongoing. Gil was that someone. The cumulative weight of a career like that is not merely professional. Inside an institution that measures credibility and operational outcomes, a record like Gil's becomes a kind of currency, one that compounds over time, purchases latitude, and eventually begins to substitute for scrutiny. By the time Gil reached his 50s, his file read as proof that his judgment could be trusted, that his sources were real, and that his methods, whatever they were, worked. The Mossad did not review his career. It relied on it. He also taught. The Mossad's training academy ran courses designed to pass the tradecraft of the founding generation to the officers who would follow. Gil stood in those classrooms as a living example of what the work could produce. The course he taught had a title that was either admirably direct or, in retrospect, something closer to a warning that no one read correctly. It was called Lying as an Art. He taught it with a flair that his trainees remembered for years. He once faked a heart attack mid-lecture, sending students scrambling to call an ambulance. Another time, he drew a pistol on a trainee, held it level, and watched the trainee dissolve. These were not accidents of temperament. They were demonstrations, controlled, deliberate, designed to produce a specific effect in the room. The effect was always the same. Gil was the most dangerous person present, and everyone in the room should know it. What none of those trainees knew, and what the Mossad itself would not know for years, was that the man teaching them to lie had already begun practicing on them, not in the classroom, but in the reports he was filing. There is one more piece of Gil's biography that would surface during the investigation and generate more heat than almost anything else in the case. In 1992, Gil had been affiliated with the Mossad Party, a far-right Israeli political party known specifically for advocating the transfer of Palestinians out of the West Bank and Gaza. In the years when Gil was most actively fabricating his reports, Israeli-Syrian peace talks were advancing. Hafez al-Assad and Israeli officials were engaged in negotiations that had the potential to reshape the region's political map. Gil's fabricated reports described a Syria that had not abandoned the military option, an Assad who was using diplomacy as cover for a war he intended to fight. Whether that alignment between Gil's political affiliations and his fabricated conclusions was coincidence, motivation, or something else entirely, the investigation never conclusively established. It remains unresolved, one of two threads in this case that were documented but never tied off. The other is simpler and in some ways more disturbing. No one at the Mossad could say precisely when the fabrication started. Gil himself, when confronted, said 5 years. The Mossad's internal assessment suggested the timeline stretched further, possibly to before his formal retirement in the early 1990s, possibly deep into the period when Red Falcon was still nominally active. The file was large. The reports were consistent, and the source at the center of them was a man whose access, and perhaps whose cooperation, had been narrowing for years before anyone looked closely enough to notice. That source had a code name, Red Falcon, and in 1975, Yehuda Gil had recruited him. Syria, in 1975, was not a country at peace with itself or with its neighbors. 2 years earlier, in October 1973, Syrian armored divisions had crossed the ceasefire line on the Golan Heights in the opening hours of the Yom Kippur War, and driven deep into Israeli-held territory before being stopped and pushed back. The attack had come without strategic warning. Israel's intelligence community, both the Mossad, which handled foreign intelligence, and Amman, military intelligence, had failed to read the signs correctly, had failed to convince the political leadership that the threat was real, and had watched the country absorb a shock that killed nearly 3,000 Israeli soldiers in 3 weeks. The failure had a name inside the Israeli intelligence community, the conceptia, the concept, the fixed assumption that Egypt and Syria would not go to war because they knew they would lose. The conceptia had been wrong. The cost of being wrong had been written in bodies. By 1975, the Israeli intelligence establishment was living inside the aftermath of that failure. It was rebuilding, restructuring, and above everything else trying to ensure it would never again be surprised by Syria. A well-placed source inside the Syrian military establishment was not merely operationally useful. It was, in the psychological climate of the post-Yom Kippur years, close to essential. Syria was the threat that had nearly undone everything. Syria was the border that kept generals awake. Any officer who could produce reliable intelligence from inside the Syrian military hierarchy was not just doing his job. He was addressing the wound the whole institution was still carrying. This is the environment into which Yehuda Gil introduced Red Falcon. The recruitment followed the standard Mossad approach for penetrating Arab targets, what the agency calls a false flag operation. The logic is straightforward. A Syrian with military connections could not realistically be expected to walk into an Israeli intelligence relationship voluntarily. The hostility was structural. The risks were existential. So the approach did not come as Israeli, it came as European. Gil and a female Mossad officer who operated under the working name Gabriel posed as Western operatives with no connection to Israel. Gabriel made the initial introduction, positioning Gil as a man worth knowing, someone from an Italian fascist background whose father had collaborated with Americans to undermine communist influence in post-war Europe. The cover story was constructed to appeal to a Syrian military man's specific suspicions and sympathies. Anti-communist, anti-Soviet in the right registers, sufficiently distant from anything that might trigger the source's defenses. The Syrian accepted the introduction. He and Gil began meeting. The source was not, as some later accounts would frame him, a Syrian general. He was a man adjacent to that level, described in the available record as a relative of a senior Syrian general, someone with genuine proximity to the military establishment without being its decision-making center. The distinction is operationally significant. What he could provide was access to conversations, to attitudes, to the kind of information that moves through personal networks rather than formal briefings. He was not reading classified orders. He was close to people who were. In the early years, that proximity appears to have produced intelligence that the Mossad assessed as credible and actionable. Red Falcon was compensated. The Mossad paid well for good sources, particularly sources in the Syrian orbit. The payments were handled through Gil, as they would be in any case-officer relationship. The handler is the source's only point of contact, the only person who carries money in and intelligence out. This structure is operationally necessary, and it creates an accountability gap that is normally bridged by trust. The case officer files reports. The reports are assessed. If they hold up, the relationship continues. If anomalies emerge, they are investigated. The system works when the case officer is honest. It has almost no mechanism for catching one who isn't, except time and accumulated doubt. For years, the system worked, or appeared to. Red Falcon's file grew. The intelligence he was attributed to providing shaped Israeli assessments of Syrian military intentions through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Gil's reputation inside the Mossad grew with it. He was the man running the most valuable Arab world source the agency had. That standing was not incidental to what followed. It was load-bearing. Then, in 1989, two things happened that changed the structural reality of the operation, and that the Mossad, in retrospect, should have treated as a hard stop. Red Falcon retired from his position in the Syrian army. Whatever access he had possessed derived from proximity to an active military institution. He was no longer inside it. He was an older man, removed from the circuits where genuine intelligence was generated, increasingly dependent on social connections that were themselves aging and thinning. The flow of real information from a source in that position does not gradually diminish. It stops, or it becomes the recycling of old knowledge dressed in new dates. Either way, what the source can honestly provide after retirement is a fraction of what he could provide before. Any experienced case officer knows this. It is not a subtle problem. Gill knew it too. He had spent 2 decades in this work. He understood exactly what a source's retirement meant for the intelligence value of the relationship. He also understood something else. Red Falcon was his. The source, the access, the relationship, the legend that had accumulated around it. These were the foundation of Gill's standing inside the institution. Losing the source meant losing all of that. And Gill, that same year, was passed over for promotion. The exact reasons were never made fully public, but the picture that emerged from colleagues who spoke to investigators and journalists was consistent. Gill was regarded as a brilliant individual operator, possibly one of the best the Mossad had ever produced at the level of one-on-one human source work. He was not regarded as a commander. He lacked the communicative temperament that senior leadership required, the willingness to share information, to build teams, to accept oversight as a functional part of the work rather than an obstacle to it. He had run a small station in Europe. He had held intermediate positions in Israel. The organization had concluded, quietly, that his ceiling was where he already stood. By the early 1990s, Gill formally retired. What any reasonable assessment of the situation suggested at that point was that the Red Falcon operation should have been wound down or formally transferred. The source was retired. The handler was retired. The operation had run its course. Close the file, archive the history, and move on. Gill did not allow that to happen. He came back. He told the Mossad that Red Falcon had reactivated, that the source had reached out, that there was new material, and that the source would speak only to him. Not a new handler, not a joint meeting, only Gill. The source's requirements, Gill explained, made the standard verification protocols impractical. When the Mossad Directorate pressed for a second case officer to join the meetings, Gill reported that Red Falcon had refused. When they wanted recordings of the meetings, the equipment consistently malfunctioned. When a female officer was proposed as a cover presence, that arrangement also failed to materialize. Each explanation was individually plausible. Sources do sometimes develop rigid requirements about their handlers. Equipment does malfunction. Cover arrangements do fall apart. But the cumulative pattern, every attempt at independent verification blocked by a reason that traced back to the source's reported preferences, was something the institution chose not to examine as a pattern. It examined each obstruction as a separate operational problem and accepted Gill's explanation of it. The question that the Mossad did not ask clearly enough, or did not ask at all, was the one that should have been obvious by 1992. Why would a retired Syrian source with diminishing access suddenly reactivate and produce intelligence of increasing specificity? And why would he do so only for a retired Israeli case officer with no institutional standing to offer in return? That question had an answer. It was not the answer the Mossad was prepared to consider. The Mossad did not stumble into this failure blind. There was a moment, 15 years before the troops moved toward the Syrian border, when the system had everything it needed to catch what Yehuda Gill was doing. The evidence was documented. The objection was filed. The analyst who raised it was credible, specific, and correct. And the institution, faced with a choice between investigating one of its most celebrated officers and accepting his report at face value, made the easier choice. That moment was 1981. In the summer of that year, Gill filed a report attributed to Red Falcon, describing Syrian military preparations that indicated an imminent attack on Israel. The report reached the desk of Mossad Director Yitzhak Hofi. Hofi had commanded IDF forces on the Northern Front during the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. He had watched Syrian armor drive through Israeli lines in the opening hours of that war. He had lived through the chaos of a surprise attack that the intelligence community had failed to predict, and he carried that experience not as history but as something closer to a permanent operational posture, a reflex that Gill's report now triggered. Hofi conveyed the intelligence immediately to the military high command. What happened in those rooms was not a measured analytical review. It was a collision between a piece of paper and the accumulated trauma of the worst intelligence failure in Israeli history. Chief of General Staff Raphael Eitan had fought in the Yom Kippur War. Northern Commander Avigdor Ben-Gail had fought in the Yom Kippur War. Both men had lost colleagues. Both men had nearly been killed. Both men now sat across a table from a report that described exactly the scenario they had sworn, in the visceral way that survivors of catastrophe make promises to themselves would never catch them unprepared again. Eitan and Ben-Gail wanted to call up all the reserves. The head of Ayman's Syria desk at the time was a man named Eli Halachmi. He looked at Gill's report and then looked at the broader intelligence picture, the signals, the collateral sourcing, the pattern of Syrian military activity as it was actually presenting itself, and reached a conclusion that put him directly in the path of two of the most powerful military figures in Israel. The reserve call-up, Halami said, was absurd. What he saw in Gill's report did not match what the rest of the available intelligence was indicating. The specificity of the attack scenario, the timing, the claimed Syrian intent, none of it aligned with what other sources and analytical threads were producing. Halami held his position. The escalation was blocked. Israel did not mobilize. The alert passed without incident, but Halami did something beyond simply blocking the call-up, something that would matter enormously 16 years later, and not at all in the immediate aftermath. He wrote his objections down. In the margins of Gill's report, and in the annotations that went into Red Falcon's file, Halami recorded his specific skepticism about the intelligence, the nature of his doubts, the reasoning behind them, the conclusion that the sources reporting in this instance did not hold up under scrutiny. He filed those notes. They became part of the permanent record. And then nothing happened. No formal inquiry was opened into the quality of Gill's reporting. No verification protocol was imposed on the Red Falcon operation. No second analyst was assigned to stress test the intelligence coming through that channel. The notes stayed in the file, accurate and unactioned, while Gill continued to operate with the same access and the same unchallenged standing he had held before the alert. The institutional logic that produced this outcome was not irrational on its own terms. Gill's career record was real. The Red Falcon operation had produced what appeared to be genuine intelligence over the previous 6 years. One disputed report, even one that caused a significant internal disagreement, was not, by itself, sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation into a decorated senior officer. The Mossad was not in the habit of assuming its best people were lying. It had not built its verification systems around that assumption. It had built them around the assumption that its best people were honest, and that the risk lay outside the institution rather than inside it. That assumption was precisely what Gill had spent his career making himself a beneficiary of. There is a further dimension to the 1981 episode that only became visible in retrospect. The commanders who had pushed hardest for the reserve call-up, Eitan, Ben-Gail, Hofi, were not acting irrationally. They were acting from a model of Syrian behavior that the Yom Kippur War had burned into the institutional memory of the entire Israeli defense establishment. Syria had attacked without sufficient warning before. Syria had the capability and the historical motivation to attempt it again. A report from the Mossad's most valuable Syrian source describing exactly that scenario was, from inside that model, not alarming because it was surprising. It was alarming because it confirmed what the model already predicted. This is what made Gill's fabrications so durable. Not that they were clever, but that they were confirming. They arrived in a system primed to believe them, filed by a man whose record made them credible, and they described a Syria that the institution's most senior figures already expected to exist. The Mossad was not being manipulated into believing something foreign to its worldview. It was being manipulated into believing something it was already half convinced of. Halami had seen through this in 1981. His notes said, in essence, that the report was too neat, too aligned with existing fears, and insufficiently supported by collateral intelligence. He was right. He was also, within the hierarchy of that moment, the most junior voice in the room. He had prevailed on the immediate question of the reserve call-up. He had not prevailed on the larger question of what the episode meant about the reliability of the source and the handler. Through the remainder of the 1980s, Red Falcon's file continued to grow. Gill's standing continued to hold. The 1981 episode became, inside the institution, a moment when a cautious analyst had applied a useful check, not a warning that something structural was wrong with the operation's foundations. Then Red Falcon retired from the Syrian army in 1989. Then Gill was passed over for promotion. Then Gill retired in the early 1990s. Then Gill came back, claiming reactivation, insisting on sole access, and producing reports of increasing specificity from a source whose institutional position no longer supported the intelligence he was supposedly supplying. The questions that should have been asked at each of those junctures, about what a retired source could realistically provide, about why verification was consistently impossible, about whether the pattern of obstruction traced back to the source's requirements or to the handlers, were not asked with enough force to produce an investigation. The institutional memory of Gill's record answered them before they could fully form. By the mid-1990s, the doubts were beginning to accumulate in quieter ways. Yahia Mart, who ran the Mossad's Paris station, had conducted a series of side operations after Gill's 1990 meetings with Red Falcon, independent checks on specific claims Gill was attributing to his source. The results, according to Ronan Bergman's investigation, were not encouraging. Some of what Gill had filed did not hold up when tested against intelligence gathered through other channels. Mart raised his concerns internally. They were noted. No investigation followed. The file kept growing. The reports kept arriving. And somewhere inside the Mossad, in a cabinet or a classification system that no one had looked at carefully for over a decade, sat Eli Halami's annotations from 1981, specific, accurate, and waiting. The institution had been given a map to its own vulnerability. It had filed the map and moved on. What no one yet understood was that the map was about to become evidence. There is a particular kind of professional knowledge that becomes dangerous in the wrong hands. A surgeon who understands anatomy can heal. The same knowledge, held by someone with different intentions, describes something else entirely. The depth of the expertise does not change, the application does. Yehuda Gill had spent 20 years learning, at the highest operational level, exactly what the Mossad needed from a human source. He had sat across tables from real sources in real risk environments and understood the texture of genuine intelligence, the fragmentary quality of it, the way a source with actual access answers questions partially, offers things unprompted, contradicts himself on minor details while being consistent on the things he has directly witnessed. He knew what real looked like because he had spent a career handling it. When the real stopped coming, he knew precisely how to replace it. The mechanics, reconstructed by investigators after his arrest, were not elaborate. They were efficient. When a meeting with Red Falcon was scheduled, the Mossad's intelligence consumers, primarily Ayman, military intelligence, would brief Gill beforehand on the specific questions they needed answered. This was standard practice. You do not send a handler into a source meeting without knowing what you need to come back with. The briefing told Gill exactly what the institution was looking for, the precise gaps in their assessment of Syrian military intentions, the specific uncertainties they were trying to resolve. Gill took those questions into meetings that may have occurred without producing anything useful, or that may not have occurred at all, and he filed reports that answered them. The raw material was not invented from nothing. That is the detail that made the fabrication so resistant to casual scrutiny. Gill carried, in active memory, decades of genuine expertise about Syrian military doctrine, order of battle, command psychology, and political dynamics. He had access to open-source reporting, the kind of material that any analyst could read, but that a man with Gill's operational background could synthesize into something that read like insider intelligence. He understood how Syrian generals thought about the Golan. He understood the institutional pressures inside the Syrian military establishment. He understood what a source with Red Falcon's claimed proximity to that establishment would plausibly know, and how he would plausibly phrase it. The reports he produced were, in the assessment of people who later examined them, technically convincing. They were detailed in the right ways. They hedged in the places a real source would hedge. They contained the kind of specific but unverifiable claim that characterizes genuine human intelligence, the type of assertion that cannot be confirmed through signals or satellite imagery, but that fits coherently within the broader analytical picture. An experienced analyst reading one of Gill's fabricated reports would not have found an obvious seam. The seam was in the aggregate, in the pattern across years, in the relationship between what Red Falcon's actual access could support and what Gill was attributing to him. The money intended for the source stayed with Gill. The Mossad compensated Red Falcon through Gill, as case officer relationships require. At some point in the operation's drift from genuine intelligence work toward fabrication, the source stopped receiving what the institution believed it was paying him. Police would later find approximately $35,000 in cash in a safe at Gill's home in Gadara. Investigators traced a further sum in the range of $150,000 through additional channels. The total reported figure across various accounts was in the range of $200,000, payments that had moved through Gill's hands and stopped there. Red Falcon, in the final years of the operation, appears to have been a man receiving expensive gifts from an Israeli intelligence officer he knew as a European contact, in exchange for conversations that had long since stopped producing anything of substance. Whether he understood the full architecture of what he was part of, whether he knew that his name and his nominal access were being used to authenticate intelligence he was not providing, is not established in any public record. He was, in the most precise sense, a man whose identity had been borrowed without his full awareness of the loan. The structure Gill had built around the operation made external verification almost impossible by design. When the Mossad Directorate pressed for a second handler to join the meetings, Gill reported that Red Falcon refused. When they wanted recordings, the equipment malfunctioned. When they proposed a female officer in a cover role, the arrangement collapsed. Each obstruction arrived with a specific operational explanation rooted in the source's stated requirements, and each explanation was individually defensible enough that challenging it meant, implicitly, doubting Gill's account of what the source had said. Doubting Gill's account meant doubting Gill, and doubting Gill required overcoming 30 years of accumulated institutional evidence that he was not a man to doubt. He had, in this respect, constructed the deception from the outside in. The legend came first, built through genuinely extraordinary work over genuinely difficult years. The institutional trust that legend produced became the outer wall of the operation. Inside that wall, verification protocols that would have applied to a less celebrated officer did not apply to him, not through any explicit exemption, but through the softer mechanism of an institution that reserves its skepticism for people who have not yet proven themselves, and that allows proof of the past to answer for the present. There is a further dimension to how the fabrication sustained itself that has nothing to do with Gill's individual psychology and everything to do with what his reports were telling the institution. The intelligence Gill produced consistently described a Syria that had not abandoned the military option. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, as Israeli-Syrian peace negotiations began to acquire real momentum, as officials on both sides moved toward talks that carried the possibility of a genuine settlement, Red Falcon's intelligence regularly surfaced a contradicting signal. Assad was using the diplomatic track as cover. Syria was still preparing for war. The source inside the Syrian establishment said so. for an intelligence assessment community trying to hold two competing pictures of Syrian intent simultaneously, the diplomatic Syria and the military Syria. Reports from the Mossad's most valued Arab world source describing the military Syria carried disproportionate weight. They were not just intelligence, they were a counterweight to optimism. They were the thing that kept the worst-case scenario alive in the assessment, that prevented the analytical community from concluding too confidently that the peace track was genuine. Whether Gil fabricated in this direction deliberately, whether his affiliation with the Mossad party, documented in 1992, reflected a political commitment to ensuring the peace track failed, was a question the investigation raised and did not definitively resolve. The charge sheet focused on the operational crimes, false reporting, theft, fraud. The political dimension was documented by journalists, noted by investigators, and left without a conclusive answer. It remains one of the unresolved threads in a case that was never fully simple. What is established is the operational effect, regardless of motive. At the precise historical moment when a negotiated settlement between Israel and Syria was most plausible, when the diplomatic conditions for a deal were more favorable than they had been since 1973, the Mossad's primary human source inside the Syrian world was filing reports that said the deal was a trap. Those reports shaped how Israeli leaders read Syrian intentions. They were one input among several, and they did not single-handedly determine policy. But they were weighted heavily because of where they came from. The source was impeccable. The handler was legendary. The institution trusted the product because it trusted the man. By the mid-1990s, the product had been compromised for years. The man was constructing it alone. In the space between the questions his institution was asking and the answers a retired source with narrowing access could no longer provide. The institution did not yet know this. But inside the Mossad, in offices that had nothing to do with Gil's operation, a group of analysts had begun the kind of quiet, unsanctioned second look at a long-running file that sometimes happens when an experienced officer develops a feeling about something they cannot yet name. They went back to the beginning of Red Falcon's file and started reading. The group of Mossad analysts who pulled Red Falcon's file in the mid-1990s were not, initially, looking for fraud. They were looking for what intelligence professionals call source validation, a periodic reassessment of a long-running asset to confirm that the intelligence being produced still reflected genuine access rather than drift, fabrication, or hostile manipulation. It was, in principle, routine. In practice, for an operation of Red Falcon's standing and seniority, it had not been done with sufficient rigor in years. The file was large. The operation was old. The handler was legendary. These were, within the institution's informal hierarchy of attention, reasons to look elsewhere first. What brought them back to this file at this moment is not entirely clear from the public record. Ronan Bergman's investigation suggests the review was driven partly by accumulated anomalies, the kind of low-level institutional unease that does not constitute evidence, but that experienced analysts learn to treat as a signal worth following. The Paris station chief Yehia Mart had raised concerns after running independent checks on Gil's 1990 reporting. Those concerns had been noted and not acted on. Now, several years later, a different set of eyes was going through the same material with more time and more distance. They started at the beginning and read forward. What they found, partway through a file spanning 2 decades, were Eli Halami's annotations from 1981. The specific, caustic, precisely reasoned notes that the Ayman Syria desk chief had written during the alert that nearly produced a reserve call-up. The notes that had blocked an escalation, been filed, and then effectively forgotten. The analysts read them. They read them against what Gil had been filing in the years since. And a pattern emerged that the notes had been pointing toward for 15 years without anyone following the direction they pointed. One analyst described the initial assessment to Bergman in careful terms. The suspicion, he said, was not at first that Gil was fabricating outright. It was that this looked like a classic case of over-identification between a handler and a source, a handler who had grown so close to his asset, so invested in the relationship, and in the intelligence value it was supposed to represent, that he had begun cutting corners, embellishing, filling gaps with what the source would probably say rather than what the source had actually said. This was a more comfortable hypothesis than the alternative, and it was not an unreasonable starting point. Over-identification between handlers and sources is a documented phenomenon. It produces real intelligence failures. It is also a failure mode that stops well short of deliberate fabrication, and attributing it to Gill was a way of keeping the worst possibility at arm's length a little longer. The comfortable hypothesis did not survive contact with the evidence. As the review deepened, the picture that emerged was not one of a handler who had lost his critical distance from a source. It was one of a handler who had replaced the source entirely. The volume of intelligence attributed to Red Falcon did not scale with what his actual access, post-retirement from the Syrian army, could have supported. The specificity of the reporting was wrong in a particular direction, too aligned with the exact questions the assessment community was asking, too responsive to the institutional appetite of the moment. Real sources produce fragments. They provide partial pictures from their specific vantage point, colored by their personal understanding and their personal limitations. They do not consistently answer the precise question on the table with the precise level of detail the consumer needs. A source who does that is not reporting from the field. He is reading the field's mail. The analysts sought permission from the Israeli Attorney General to investigate Gill directly. This was not a step taken lightly. Opening a formal inquiry as to a retired senior officer of Gill's standing was an institutional act with significant internal weight, an acknowledgement that the organization was considering the possibility that one of its most celebrated members had been running a systematic deception against it for years. The permission was granted. What the investigation found was not ambiguous. Investigators confirmed that Gill had fabricated at least one meeting with Red Falcon entirely, constructed a detailed report of a conversation that had not taken place. In other instances, the evidence indicated that meetings had occurred, but that Gill had materially altered their content, manufacturing intelligence value that the source had not provided. The Syrian source, by this stage, appears to have been a man comfortable accepting expensive goods from a European contact without providing anything substantive in return. A social relationship masquerading as an intelligence operation, with only one party aware of the performance. Money intended for Red Falcon had not reached him. It had reached a safe in a house in Gadara. This is the point at which the entire architecture of the preceding 2 decades has to be reread. Because the failure here was not Yehuda Gill's alone. The failure was systemic, and it ran in a specific direction. The Mossad had built its human source operations around a correct understanding of where the external threat lay. In hostile services, in doubled agents, in sources who were being fed to Israeli intelligence by adversaries to shape Israeli assessments. It had built verification protocols for those threats. What it had not built, with anything like the same rigor, was a verification system for the threat that came from inside, from a trusted officer who understood the system's blind spots because he had helped build them. The most dangerous person in any intelligence operation is not the enemy agent on the other side of the table. It is the trusted insider who has learned, over decades of legitimate work, exactly where the institution stops looking. Gill had not stumbled into an opportunity. He had constructed one, over 30 years, by becoming indispensable and then becoming unverifiable. The legend was not a side effect of his career. In retrospect, it was the mechanism. An officer with a shorter record or a less celebrated history would have been subjected to the oversight that would have caught this. Gill's record was the reason the oversight was never applied with sufficient force. He had earned, through genuine achievement, the latitude that made the fabrication possible. This is what the mid-1990s review was really uncovering. Not just that Gill had lied, but that the institution's trust in him had been the structural condition that allowed the lies to run for years. The legend and the fraud were not separate things. They were the same operation, running in sequence. By August 1996, the investigation was building toward a formal arrest. The evidence was accumulating. The case was taking shape. And then Gil filed one more report. This one described Syria planning a lightning strike against the Golan Heights, a sudden, concentrated assault aimed at reversing 1967, aimed at reversing 1973, aimed at everything the men now sitting in Israel's high command had spent their careers trying to prevent. The report was specific. The report was urgent. The report landed in a high command populated by officers who had fought in the Yom Kippur War, who carried the conceptia as a permanent wound, who had built their professional identities around the promise that they would never again be caught unprepared by Syria. The investigation into Gil was ongoing. The doubts about his source were documented internally. And yet, the report moved through the system with the full weight of Red Falcon's two-decade reputation behind it. On September 1, 1996, Israeli troops moved toward the Syrian border. The institution that had been building a case against its most celebrated case officer had, in the same institutional moment, acted on his last fabrication as though it were fact. The verification system and the operational system ran on separate tracks, and the operational system moved faster. The troops stood down when other intelligence contradicted the strike scenario. The alert passed. Gil's report was not, in the end, the thing that started the war, but the system that had nearly let it become that thing was the same system that had been protecting him for 15 years. The investigation had been running for months before anyone touched Gil. That gap matters. The Mossad had evidence. It had the internal review. It had Mart's earlier findings from Paris. It had the pattern in the file, the financial irregularities beginning to take shape, and Halami's annotations confirming that the doubts were not new. What it did not yet have was the Attorney General's formal authorization to move against a retired senior officer by name. It sought that authorization carefully, quietly. The request itself was a sensitive document, an acknowledgement in writing that the institution suspected one of its most decorated members of systematic fraud. The wrong person, seeing it too early, could collapse the investigation before it produced a usable case. The authorization came. The investigation moved to its next phase. And then it nearly stopped. The problem was Gil himself. He was not an ordinary subject. He had spent 30 years learning how institutions pursue people, how surveillance is constructed, how investigators build cases, where the pressure points are and how to read them. He had taught these things. He had taught them in a classroom called Lying as an Art to a generation of officers who were now, in some cases, the people trying to build the case against him. The investigation had to assume at every stage that its subject was capable of reading what was being done to him. The early phase of direct inquiry produced almost nothing usable. Gil was interviewed. He was measured, cooperative, and completely opaque. He gave answers that were consistent with his own established account of the Red Falcon operation. His source was real. His meetings had occurred. The intelligence had been genuine. He expressed appropriate concern about the questions being raised and offered to assist in any way the institution required. His lawyer, Yigal Shapira, a former Mossad employee who understood the institution's legal and operational culture from the inside, told investigators and later Israeli television that Gil had not confessed. A line of defense would be formulated. There was nothing to confess to. The investigation hit a wall. Then investigators shifted approach. Instead of pressing Gil directly on the intelligence, they followed the money. The financial trail was less susceptible to narrative management than the operational record. A source who claimed his meetings had occurred could construct a coherent account of what was discussed. A financial discrepancy was harder to explain away. The payments intended for Red Falcon had moved through Gil. The question was where they had gone after that. The answer came from Gadara. Gil led investigators to his house. In a safe on the property, they found approximately $35,000 in cash. It was sitting there, not hidden with particular sophistication, not dispersed through accounts or moved offshore. Sitting in a safe in a house in a small town south of Tel Aviv, in the home of a man who had been telling his institution for years that his source was being compensated for ongoing risk. The discovery cracked the operational account open. A source being actively run does not accumulate in a handler's safe. Money flows to the source. It does not stay. The cash in Gadara was not evidence of a handler who had embellished reports. It was evidence of a handler who had kept the source's payments while filing intelligence the source had not provided. The gap between those two things, embellishment and invention, had been the institution's last psychological refuge, the version of events that preserved some portion of Gill's reputation and limited the scale of the failure. The cash closed that refuge. Investigators began tracing additional funds. The total picture that emerged pointed toward a sum in the range of $200,000 across the full period, money that had moved through the operation and not reached its intended destination. Some of it was recoverable, some was not. Gill's position shifted. Not immediately, not cleanly. He did not walk into an interview room and produce a full account of what he had done. What happened was slower and more ambiguous, the kind of partial acknowledgement that a man makes when the evidence has closed off the denial, but the full admission still costs more than he is prepared to pay in a single moment. He gave an interview to Yediot Aharonoth, not to investigators, to a newspaper. The statement he produced was not a confession in any legal sense. It was something more compressed and more revealing than that. He said, "I know I did something that should never have been done. That was it. No elaboration. No account of duration or method or motivation. One sentence that confirmed the core of the allegation while surrendering nothing about its mechanics. His lawyer had said there was nothing to confess. Gill had just told a newspaper there was. The charge sheet that followed was specific. The Mossad career starting in 1970. The years of false reporting. The charges, relaying information with the intention to harm state security. Theft, fraud. The Tel Aviv District Court lifted a publication ban on Gill's name on a Saturday night in December 1997. His photograph was withheld. The court ruled that publishing it would damage state security, a decision that carried its own quiet irony. The man had been filing fabricated intelligence for years. His face was still considered a protected asset. The story broke publicly that weekend. Ze'ev Schiff, the Haaretz military editor who had been working the story through Israeli censorship for weeks, published. The details moved through the Israeli press in the compressed, partial way that intelligence stories always do when military censors are involved. Facts visible in outline, specific operational details blurred, the shape of the scandal clear even when its dimensions were still being negotiated between editors and censors. Prime Minister Netanyahu made a public statement. Israel, he said, never based its assessments on a single source. Its judgments on Syria, on any sensitive issue, were drawn from a range of sources and analysts. The statement was technically accurate. It was also a precise map of the problem. If the assessments had always rested on multiple sources, then Red Falcon had been one input among several. And if Red Falcon had been fabricated for years, then for years the assessments had been built on a foundation with a deliberate flaw running through it. Not the only foundation, but one that had been weighted heavily because of the source's reputation and the handler's standing. Netanyahu's assurance that the system had other inputs was meant to be reassuring. It also confirmed that those other inputs had not been sufficient to catch what Gill was doing. Inside the intelligence community, the damage assessment was brutal and immediate. Ron Ben Ishai, one of Israel's most respected military journalists, wrote in Yediot that the Gill affair was more damaging to the Mossad than the Mashal assassination attempt in Jordan 2 months earlier, the operation in which Mossad operatives had been caught trying to poison a Hamas leader in Amman, triggering a diplomatic crisis with Jordan and forcing Israel to provide an antidote and release a prisoner. That operation had been a catastrophic external failure. Gill was something the institution had no established category for. In 46 years, Ben Ishai wrote, there had never been an instance of a Mossad officer filing a false report. That record was now gone, and the man who had ended it was sitting in custody, having told a newspaper in one sentence that he knew what he had done, while his lawyer prepared a defense that would eventually claim he had done nothing at all. The trial date was set. The institution that had celebrated Yehuda Gil for 30 years was now preparing to prosecute him in secret, in a closed courtroom, for crimes against the same institution whose trust he had spent 3 decades accumulating. The hearing would be held behind closed doors. His photograph would not be published. His name finally was out. On March 24, 1999, Yehuda Gil was found guilty of espionage and theft in a secret trial. The courtroom was closed. The proceedings were not published. The verdict emerged into public record as a fact without texture, a date, a finding, a sentence. 5 years, on charges that included relaying information with the intention to harm state security, theft, and fraud. The institution that had built its reputation on operating in darkness had tried its own man in darkness, and the darkness was the last operational courtesy it extended to him. He was released in December 2000. Roughly 20 months served. His term reduced for good behavior. He had taught a course called Lying as an Art. He had filed fabricated intelligence for years. He had brought his country to the edge of a war neither side wanted. He served less time than many men convicted of burglary. The gap between the scale of what he had done and the length of his sentence was not an accident of the legal system. It was a consequence of the same institutional logic that had protected him for years. A full public trial would have required surfacing the specific intelligence he had fabricated, the operations that had been shaped by it, the assessments that had been contaminated by it. It would have required the Mossad to account, in open court, for how long its most celebrated officer had been lying to it. The secret trial was not only about protecting Gil, it was about protecting the institution from the full inventory of what his fabrications had touched. The fallout was uncontained regardless. Danny Yatom had been Mossad director when the investigation was opened, when Gil was arrested, when the story broke publicly in December 1997. He had also been director during the Mashal operation in Jordan 2 months earlier, the botched assassination attempt that had sent operatives to Amman to poison a Hamas leader in daylight, gotten them caught, triggered a diplomatic crisis with King Hussein, and forced Israel to provide an antidote and release a prisoner to get its people back. 2 catastrophic failures in the same season, from the same institution, on the same director's watch. Yatom resigned in February 1998. The official accounting pointed primarily to Mashal as the breaking point. The Gil affair had compounded the weight on a directorship that was already collapsing under it. He left without being charged with anything. He went on to a career in Israeli politics, serving in the Knesset. He was never implicated in Gil's crimes. In 2010, Gil gave an interview to Haaretz. He spoke with journalist Yossi Melman, who had covered Israeli intelligence for decades. The man who had told Yediot Aronoth in 1997 that he knew what he had done should never have been done, and now said the opposite. He was innocent. He had been framed. The person responsible, he claimed, was Danny Yatom, the Mossad director who had ordered the investigation, who had, in Gil's new telling, manufactured the case against him to protect his own position during the Mashal crisis. The claim was documented. Melman reported it accurately. It is part of the public record of this case. It is also the claim of a convicted man, made 13 years after his conviction, directly contradicting his own earlier statement to a different newspaper. The conviction was not revisited. No new evidence emerged to support the allegation. Gil had said in 1997 that he knew what he had done. He said in 2010 that he had done nothing. Both statements are on record. The trial record stands between them. Eli Halemi, the Amman Syria desk analyst who in 1981 had written his objections into Red Falcon's file, who had blocked the reserve call-up, who had been right about the source's credibility for 15 years before anyone went looking, received no particular public recognition for what he had done. His name appears in Ronan Bergman's investigation as a man who saw clearly and was not listened to. That is the entirety of his documented aftermath. He had built the case against Gil before the case existed. He had filed the evidence before the crime was formally named. The institution had walked past his annotations for 16 years, and when it finally found them, it used them to prosecute a man Halami had flagged in the margin of a report in 1981. The secondary thread that runs through this case, the 1981 alert, the near-reserve call-up, the notes that went unfollowed, does not resolve into a story about one analyst being vindicated. It resolves into something less comfortable. Halami was right, and it made almost no difference to the timeline. The institution found his annotations useful eventually. It had not found them urgent when they were filed. The gap between those two things, between evidence that exists and evidence that is acted on, is where the real failure lived, and it lived there for 15 years before anyone measured it. Red Falcon disappears from the record entirely. His identity was never confirmed publicly. His fate was never reported. Whether he understood the full extent to which his name and his nominal access had been used to authenticate 20 years of fabricated intelligence is not known. He had been, in the final years of the operation, a man receiving expensive goods from a European contact in exchange for conversations that had long since stopped producing anything of value. He was the ghost at the center of the story, the source who made the operation real in its early years and whose retirement and subsequent irrelevance became the condition the fraud required to run. Syria's state newspaper, the Syria Times, published a response when the story broke publicly in December 1997. The editorial expressed hope that Israel, now that the false intelligence had been exposed, would approach the peace process with greater openness. It was a composed statement, almost clinical. It did not need to say more than it said. Israeli military commanders had nearly launched a preemptive war based on a report that a Syrian government publication was now calling, in the plainest available language, a lie. The peace track that Gill's fabrications had consistently undermined, the Israeli-Syrian negotiations that his reports had described as cover for Syrian military preparation, did not recover its momentum. Hafez al-Assad died in 2000. The diplomatic window that had existed in the mid-1990s did not reopen in the same form. Whether Gill's reports were a meaningful factor in that outcome, or merely one thread among the many that pulled the negotiations apart, is not a question the historical record answers cleanly. What is established is the direction. The fabrications pointed consistently against the peace track, across the years when the peace track was most viable, and they were weighted heavily because of where they appeared to come from. Inside the Mossad, the institutional response to the Gill affair produced changes to source verification and handler oversight protocols that remain classified in their specifics. What is not classified is the reason they were necessary. The system had a gap. The gap had a shape. The shape was the assumption that an officer's past record was sufficient authorization for his present claims, that a legend earned through genuine achievement could be extended indefinitely forward without independent verification of what it was currently producing. That assumption was wrong. It had been wrong for years before anyone tested it. The most dangerous person in any intelligence operation is not the adversary across the table. It is the trusted insider who has spent decades learning exactly where the institution stops looking, and who understands, because he helped build the institution, that the place it stops looking is the place it most needs to see. Gill had known this. He had taught it, in one form, to a generation of officers. The course was called Lying as an Art. The central lesson, the one that made deception durable rather than merely clever, was this: the lie that lasts is not the one that contradicts what the listener believes. It is the one that confirms it, arriving through the right channel, from the right source, in the right format, at the right moment. The listener does the rest. For years, the Mossad had done the rest. Its best analysts, its most senior commanders, its directors, had consumed Gill's fabrications and found them credible because credibility had been built into the channel before the fabrications began. The legend was not a side effect of his career. It was the operating infrastructure of the fraud. What was lost, and what cannot be recovered, is not easily measured in operational terms. The specific assessments that were contaminated, the specific decisions that were shaped by false intelligence, the specific moments when the peace track absorbed a weight it should not have had to carry, these remain partially classified, partially unresolved, and permanently irreversible. The troops that moved to the Syrian border on September 1, 1996, stood down. The war did not happen. Those particular consequences were contained. What was not contained was simpler and more durable, the clean record of an institution that could say, before December 1997, that in 46 years no officer had filed a false report. That record is gone. What replaced it is a case study that intelligence agencies examine not because it is exotic, but because it is ordinary. It required nothing external, no penetration, no hostile recruitment. One officer, one legend, one file, and a system that trusted its memory more than it tested its present.